The dream always started the same way. A girl with sand-colored hair, standing at the edge of something dark, looking back over her shoulder. Her eyes were the specific pale green of old glass, the kind you found in the rubble of buildings that predated the occupation. She never spoke. She just looked at Mara Voss with an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite a plea. It was something more patient than either, something that said, "You will understand this eventually." Then the neural suppressor mounted at the base of Mara's skull would pulse, and the dream would dissolve into static, and she would wake on her cot in the compliance bureau dormitory, with the copper taste of a minor seizure in her mouth, and the cold certainty that she had forgotten something important. She'd been having the dream for 4 months. She hadn't told anyone. The suppressor was standard issue for anyone above Tier 3 in the bureau hierarchy. Not a punishment. The Velkarath's human relations liaison had explained during her induction 11 years ago, when she was 22, and still told her that working for the bureau was a form of resistance rather than a form of surrender. A tool for focus, the liaison had said. The Velkarath weren't a species that wasted time on the vocabulary of control. They simply called things what they were, from their own perspective. The suppressor was for focus, for reducing what the liaison had termed, in the flat neutrality of the official translation, the noise of your species' overactive subconscious. What it actually did, Mara had spent 11 years quietly learning, was prevent humans from thinking clearly about certain categories of things, about the Dominion structure, about the harvest cycles, about what genetic tithing actually meant for the people who disappeared. The suppressor ran on a low-frequency pulse, calibrated to interfere with the specific cognitive resonances the Velkarath had identified in their research documentation as most likely to produce coordination and dissent. Broad-spectrum suppression would have been obvious. The calibrated version was surgical. Most people who wore it for long enough simply began to assume that their thoughts on certain subjects had always been hazy, had always required more effort than other thoughts, had always produced a faint headache that suggested maybe it wasn't worth pursuing. The suppressor worked imperfectly on Mara. It always had. She'd never reported that. She was eating the gray protein paste that constituted breakfast in the bureau cafeteria, staring at the smog column rising from the Velkarath processing tower 2 kilometers north. When her supervisor found her, the tower's column was thicker in the mornings. Something in the Dominion's operational cycle produced higher exhaust volumes overnight. Mara had been watching it for years and had never managed to determine the mechanism. The Bureau's technical analysts either hadn't noticed or didn't find it worth reporting, which told her something about what the Bureau's technical analysts had become. "You have a private consultation at 0900, her supervisor said, setting a data chip on the table beside her tray. His name was Dresch. He was a soft-faced man who had held his position for 16 years by mastering the specific art of not appearing to care about anything. He cared. Mara knew. She had always been able to read him more clearly than was probably healthy for their professional relationship, but he had gotten very good at presenting a surface of bureaucratic indifference, because caring visibly in the bureau was a reliable way of getting noticed by the people. "You didn't want to notice you." "Private how?" she asked, without looking up from the smog. "Citizen tier, collaborator class." He sat down across from her, which was unusual. Dresch almost never sat. He stood at her shoulder for brief communications and moved on. Sitting meant the conversation was something he wanted to have control over. Name's Estival, Senior Distribution Coordinator for the Dominion's Eastern Food Network. He's got pull with the Tower Administration, which means he has pull with us. She looked at the chip. What does he want? His daughter is missing. Mara finally looked up. Dresch had the expression he wore when something worried him in a way that exceeded ordinary bureaucratic concern. A slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness to the rest of his face that was different from his usual practiced blankness, because it cost him something. She watched him not show what he was feeling, and she watched the effort. How long? She asked. 8 days. That's tower jurisdiction, not ours. He's asking for you specifically. Dresch looked at the chip rather than at her. He says he doesn't trust the Dominion investigators. Nobody trusts the Dominion investigators. That's not a criterion for involvement. He says his daughter was selected. The word sat between them, like something left on the table deliberately. In the official language of the Dominion's human relations documents, selection referred to the genetic tithing program, citizens of exceptional biological profile, youth, cognitive vitality, certain measurable physiological symmetries that the Velcrath's assessment protocols were calibrated to identify, were periodically evaluated, and, if they met Dominion standards, designated for cultural integration. They were then collected by harvest teams and transported to the processing tower. No one who went to the processing tower had ever come back, but the Bureau's official position was that successfully integrated citizens were simply living in facilities above the clearance level of ordinary human administrators, in a higher stratum of the Dominion's social structure. Everyone above a certain age knew this was untrue. The knowing was the kind that lived in the body rather than the mind, in the way people crossed streets when harvest teams were visible, in the way parents of designated children stopped looking directly at their neighbors, in the way the collaborator class spoke carefully around the subject, even in their own homes. No one said it plainly. The suppressor saw to that for those who wore one, and social survivals saw to it for everyone else. He thinks she ran, Mara said, or was taken by someone before the official team arrived. Dresch stood, which meant the conversation was concluding. Either way, she's gone, and he's a well-connected man, asking for a discreet investigator who isn't reporting to the tower. He's paying in fuel cells and clean protein rations. A pause, the kind where he was deciding whether to say the next thing. Don't say no. Mara took the chip. She spent the morning running Estival through the Bureau's records. The profile was consistent with what Dresch had described. A man who had understood the mechanics of the occupation early, had positioned himself accordingly, and had maintained his position through a combination of genuine competence in logistics management and a careful policy of never asking questions that would produce uncomfortable answers. He had 3 children. The oldest was Lena, 19. The second was a boy named Kale, 16. The third was still in primary education. His wife had a civilian clearance 1 tier below his own. Lena's designation file was brief. Assessed 8 months ago under standard protocol. Identified as meeting Dominion criteria. Slated for collection in the current cycle. There was a notation in the assessment that Mara had to read 3 times before the suppressor made it clear enough to process. Neurological profile, threading resonance present, above threshold. The words blurred when she tried to focus on them. The suppressor pushed hard against that specific cognitive frequency, the one that wanted to follow that thread and understand what it meant. She let it. Memorized the words and let the suppressor do its work. And she filed the thought part of her mind she'd spent 11 years, learning to keep off the suppressor's calibrated frequency, the interior room, where she'd been quietly accumulating the things she wasn't supposed to understand. The Estival residence was on the 14th floor of a collaborator class block near the Eastern Distribution Hub. The elevator worked, which was notable. Elevator maintenance was a resource allocation. The Dominion extended to collaborator tier buildings as a matter of practical efficiency rather than comfort. But in the outer districts, it was increasingly theoretical. The air inside the building had the chemical sweetness that was concentrated near the tower and its associated infrastructure, a smell Mara had never been able to neutralize in her own perception, though she knew some people found it reassuring in the way that ambient sounds from a place of power can feel like evidence that the power is functioning in your favor. Estival met her at the door. He was a large man who had once been physically formidable. She could read it in the bone structure, the way he held himself, the size of his hands. But who had padded out in the way that happened to men who ate reliably while the people around them didn't. The softness had a moral quality she suspected he was aware of. He moved through his own apartment with the particular care of a man conscious that he takes up more space than he should. His wife sat against the far wall with the blank composure of someone who had exhausted their available processing capacity several days ago and was running on the automatic functions of posture and breath. Mara recognized it. She had seen it on the faces of designated citizens' families before. There was nothing to say to it that helped the boy. KL, the 16-year-old, was visible in the doorway to a side room, watching her with naked hostility. She met his eyes for a moment, cataloged him, let him watch. "Investigator Voss," Esteval said. "I'm grateful you came. Tell me about your daughter," Mara said. He told her. Lena had been assessed 8 months ago. The family had received the designation notification through the standard administrative channel, the same interface used for tax filings and resource allocation updates. Esteval had, in his telling, immediately begun exploring what connections he had with the Tower administration, what relationships built over 15 years of logistics cooperation might be leveraged to revise or delay the designation. He had found, in 8 months of careful inquiry, that the answer was nothing. The Velkarath's administrative relationships with human collaborators were transactional in the strict sense. He had provided value in the form of operational competence, and the Dominion had provided resources and security. There was no credit balance. There was no debt they could be called on to honor. He had value as long as he produced value, and the disposition of his daughter was simply not a category in which his production was relevant. Lena had not taken the designation well. In her father's careful language, she had become involved with difficult people in the months following the notification. She had begun spending time outside the collaborator district, in the mixed-tier areas of the city, where the population was less regulated and the Bureau's presence was thinner. She had stopped coming home for meals, and then, 8 days ago, she had not come home at all. "I need to find her before the harvest team does," Esteval said. He said it the way a man says a thing he has said many times and still cannot make sound like what he needs it to sound like. "If she's here, if she's home when they arrive, I can present that as cooperation. There are protocols for family compliance that might allow for timeline revision, given my relationship with the administration." "I have." "Where did she go?" Mara said. She hadn't intended to cut him off. She did it because the suppressor had spiked at the word timeline, and she needed to push forward before the frequency interference thickened. Esteval paused. He picked up a handset from the side table and extended it toward her. On the screen was a photograph, a girl photographed in profile, not aware of the camera, her attention directed at something outside the frame with an expression of focused attention. Sand-colored hair, pale green eyes. The suppressor hit Mara hard enough that she held herself very still, controlling the visible response with the specific practice of 11 years. The girl in the dream was real. The girl in the dream had a name. The girl in the dream was standing 2 levels below this building, in the dark, alive, and she had been putting her face in Mara Voss's sleeping mind for 4 months. Mara looked at the photograph for what she calculated was a normal length of time. She set the handset down. "Where did she go?" she said again. "Below," the wife said. The first word she had spoken since Mara arrived. Her voice had the quality of a surface that had been worn completely smooth. "She went into the access tunnels. Someone showed her where." Mara noted the implication of that. Not that she found the tunnels herself, but that someone showed her and kept it off her face. She told Esteval she would find his daughter. She did not tell him what she intended to do when she did. She said goodbye to the wife, who didn't respond. She said goodbye to Esteval, who thanked her with the specific gratitude of a man who doesn't fully believe in what he's asking for, but has run out of alternatives. At the door, she turned back and looked at Cahill, still in the side room doorway. He was watching her with the pale green eyes. His sister had passed down to the dream in Mara's head. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she left. Back at the bureau, she pulled everything on the eastern access tunnels. The files were thin. A structural survey from 11 years ago, a maintenance report from 9, noting pressure seal degradation in a sub-level system, and a single field report from a bureau officer named Kavash, who had gone below in 2046. The report described a 3-day absence from duty, and, on return, what the incident log characterized with the specific clinical neutrality of paperwork, designed to obscure rather than record as minor psychological disturbance, unrelated to operational exposure. Kavash had requested a transfer to the Western District within a week, and had, as far as Mara could find, never again discussed the Eastern tunnels or what he had found in them. She tried to pull Kavash's personal file to read the context. The file was flagged. Not flagged by the Bureau, flagged by the tower. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to the evidence lockup and signed out a torch, a sidearm she wasn't supposed to carry off duty, and a suppressor bypass kit she had been assembling for 3 years from components she'd told the quartermaster were for routine maintenance. The bypass kit was the most dangerous thing she owned. It didn't disable the suppressor. Disabling the suppressor would trigger an automatic alert, but it attenuated the suppression pulse down to approximately 20% of normal output. Enough to let her think clearly. Enough to let the cognitive frequencies the Dominion had spent years dampening operate at something close to full capacity. She used it rarely. She was using it now. The first thing she thought clearly about. Walking toward the eastern access tunnels, through the chemical-sweet afternoon air, was the nature of the dream. Not the girl. She was already thinking clearly enough about the girl. More clearly than comfortable. She thought about the quality of the dream's recurrence. The same image, the same angle, the same patient green eyes, without variation across 4 months. That level of consistency wasn't how her own unconscious worked. She knew how her own unconscious worked, had mapped its habits during years of bureau work where reading the difference between her own cognition and the suppressor's interference was a survival skill. The dream had an external source. She had found the phrase resonance, threading in a stolen Velcarath research document 2 years ago, buried in a file she'd accessed through a security gap in the Bureau's records exchange with the tower. A gap she had identified and preserved, without reporting, one of a collection of such gaps she'd been quietly maintaining since year 3 of her tenure. The document had described, in the Velcarath's characteristic tone of scientific cataloging, a neurological capacity identified in a small percentage of the human population, the ability to maintain persistent cognitive links with other individuals, transmitting and receiving across distances, through stress responses, through altered states, through neural suppression fields that weren't perfectly calibrated to the individual's specific resonance profile. The suppressor worked imperfectly on Mara. She had suspected for 2 years, and was now nearly certain, a threader. The access shaft was behind a decommissioned utility substation, on a street that nobody had any reason to use since the substation went offline 4. The door was sealed with a Velcarath administrative lock, not a street-facing security installation, which would have been obvious, but a subtle interior mechanism on a door that looked like rust-sealed panel access. She recognized the lock model. The Bureau had been issued override codes for it as part of a routine administrative package 18 months ago, a package she had processed personally. The presence of a tower lock on a supposedly abandoned utility access meant the Velcarath, or their Bureau, proxies had been down here recently enough to care about securing the entrance. She used the override. The lock opened. The shaft dropped into darkness that smelled of rust and filtered water, and something else, something organic and inhabited, the smell of a space where breath had been accumulating for years. She went down. The first 2 levels were utility corridor, exactly as the survey maps described. Ancient pipe systems, the skeletal infrastructure of preoccupation, civil engineering, emergency lighting. So long ago, the fixtures had corroded past any plausible repair. Her torch beam cut through the dark and showed her walls that had been systematically tagged with a marking system she didn't recognize immediately. Not the defacement she would have expected from isolated individuals, but a structured notation that repeated at consistent intervals and varied in ways that suggested grammatical function. Navigation. Someone had mapped this space in a way designed to be read by multiple people over time. She stood at a junction and studied the marks with the bypass kit running. A square symbol repeated twice with a vertical bar through it on the right-hand passage. A circle symbol, once with no bar on the left. She made a decision. Circles meant open space, squares meant obstruction. She went left. The tunnel opened, then opened again, descending in stages through what had been utility access, and then deeper through layers she didn't have maps for. Older construction, the bones of infrastructure that predated the Bureau's survey, predated the occupation itself, the subterranean archaeology of a city built on the compacted remains of its earlier selves. 23 minutes after entering the shaft, she walked through a low archway into a vaulted chamber, the size of a pre-occupation transit interchange, and stopped. The chamber was full of people, not crowded. The scale of the space was such that 2,000 people could have occupied it without feeling pressed, but inhabited with the deliberate thoroughness of a community that had organized its space with intention. The ceiling vaulted 20 meters above and was strung with lighting, chemical lights in strings, salvaged electrical systems running from power sources she couldn't immediately identify, and in several zones, what she recognized as hydroponic grow lamps, casting a low green warmth across the floor below. The floor was divided into living quarters with makeshift walls and hanging textiles, workshop spaces where people bent over equipment she couldn't fully categorize from the entrance, communal areas where children sat in groups with adults who might be teachers or parents or both. There was a smell of cooked food, actual cooked food, from somewhere deeper in the space. There were, she counted by zones, keeping her face neutral, doing the mental arithmetic, approximately 1,500 people visible in this chamber. The conversation that had been happening throughout the space died when she entered. It didn't die all at once. It died in a wave that started nearest to her and propagated outward, the way silence moves through a crowd that has noticed something alarming. Faces turned toward her. The gray and black of her bureau jacket was as visible in this space as a lamp in a dark room, and it carried the same information. She stopped walking. She put her hands where they could be seen. Her right hand was near the sidearm, but not on it, and she moved it slightly farther away, with a deliberateness she intended to be readable. Nothing happened for a long moment. The chamber held its breath. Then a woman stepped out of the crowd to her left and walked toward her with the unhurried directness of someone who has made a decision. She was perhaps 50, lean in the way of people who had spent years treating food as a resource to be managed rather than a comfort to be enjoyed. Her hair was silver and cut close to her skull. She moved with the specific economy of someone who had long since shed every physical habit that tease a purpose. Her face showed the kind of weathering that came from years of variable temperature and no cosmetics, and the cumulative small damage of difficult conditions. But beneath it there was a structural quality, a bone-deep solidity, that told Mara this woman had been in the dark for a long time and had found it more clarifying than frightening. She stopped 2 meters from Mara and looked at her. Not at the jacket, past the jacket. Bureau, she said. Yes, Mara said. Those two things don't separate in my experience. Her tone was conversational, not hostile, not warm. Evaluating. I know. Mara held eye contact. I'm looking for a girl named Lena Estival, 19 years old. She came down in the past 8 days. Something moved through the crowd behind the woman. A shift, a collective recalibration, too complex to read entirely. The woman's expression didn't change. Why are you looking for her? She asked. Her father hired me to find her, to return her above. That's what he thinks. The woman studied her. The evaluation continued. What do you think? Mara said. I think I've been dreaming about her for 4 months. and I think I need to understand what that means." The silence that followed had a different quality from the cautious silence that had met her entry. Something in it was attentive in a new way. The woman looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was recalibrating, sorting her from one category into another. "Come with me," the woman said. Her name was Sarat. She'd come below 18 years ago. She explained as she led Mara deeper into the tunnel system, after the first harvest cycle had taken her sister. She had understood clearly, she said, that her own eventual designation was not a matter of probability, but of timing, and she had made the decision to remove herself from the calculable population before that timing arrived. "I was 32, she said, navigating the tunnels without a torch, moving through the marking system by what appeared to be memory precise enough to function as proprioception. Outside the usual assessment window, they tend not to look at people past 25, but I'd already understood by then that 10 was not a category I could build my life on." She turned left at a junction without hesitating. There were 60 of us in the first year, people who had read the situation clearly and made the same calculation I had. By year 3, 300. By year 6, we had contact with tunnel groups under 2 other sectors. We have today approximately 9,000 people across the network under this city. Mara walked in her light and thought about the fuel cells and clean protein Esteval had offered as payment. She thought about what 9,000 people with 18 years of preparation could build in the dark under a city that thought they were a residual population subsisting on salvage. "What are you preparing for?" she asked. Sarat walked for a moment without answering. They passed through a low section of tunnel where the ceiling dropped to 1.5 meters, and Mara had to bend her head. And then it opened again into a broader passage with the marks of old engineering, arched brickwork from well before the occupation, the bones of something that had been built by human hands that hadn't expected any of this. "The harvest cycle completes in 11 days, Sarat said. "This cycle for this city alone, the Velkarath have designated 412 citizens." She paused at a junction, turned and looked at Mara directly. "You should know what I'm about to tell you. Given why you're here and what you said about the dream, you've probably been kept from knowing it by that device at the base of your skull. But I think you'll find it fits a shape you've already felt." The suppressor pulsed, hard, a preemptive spike, as if the device had some sensitivity to the category of information approaching. "Tell me," Mara said, "do you know what resonance threading is?" The spike came again. Mara breathed through it. "Yes," she said. Sarat looked at the bypass kit on Mara's wrist. She didn't say anything about it. She turned and kept walking. "The tithing isn't about genetics," she said. "It's never been about genetics. That's the administrative language. It's designed to make the designation feel like a physical assessment, like being graded for a resource the Dominion needs. It's designed to make it feel impersonal." She stopped at a door that had been new once, a very long time ago, and put her hand on a mechanisms that wasn't part of the original architecture. What they're actually screening for is threading resonance, the capacity to form persistent cognitive links, the capacity to transmit and receive across distance, through suppression fields, through physical barriers. She looked at Mara over her shoulder. They've been doing it for 30 years. Every harvest cycle, the designated citizens, the young, the cognitively vital, the ones who meet the Velkarath's profile, are almost entirely threaders. The Velkarath have been screening for threading capacity since the first year of the occupation, using the designation assessment as their instrument. The door opened. Light beyond it, warm and electrical. "What do they use them for?" Mara asked, though she already felt the shape of the answer assembling itself from fragments she'd been carrying, without context, for years. "The Dominion's communication network," Sarat said, "runs through approximately 600 human threaders currently integrated into their systems, living signal routers, permanently connected to the Velkarath's transmission architecture, unable to be disconnected without killing the host, conscious and experiencing and carrying every signal the Dominion transmits through them for the rest of their natural lives. She stepped through the door. She stepped through the door. The people who went to the tower are still alive. They are not integrated into an administrative upper tier. They are wires. They are cables. They are the infrastructure that holds the Dominion's communication apparatus together in this sector of space, and they cannot leave. Mara stopped moving. She stood in the tunnel with the suppressor pushing hard against the cognitive frequencies that wanted to process what she'd just heard, and she felt the shape of 11 years of information rearrange itself around a structure. She finally had context to see the people who went to the tower were still alive, trapped, present, carrying the weight of an alien civilization's communications through their minds, unable to stop, unable to leave for the rest of their lives. 412 people in this city alone, every 11 years, for 30 years. She went through the door. The room beyond was smaller than the main hub, but brighter. Actual electric lighting, running from a power source she now identified as a salvaged and modified Velkarath unit, the kind that had been declared decommissioned by the tower's maintenance records, but apparently hadn't been disposed of. The room held perhaps 30 people at workstations, assembled from Bureau salvage, Velkarath components she recognized from restricted equipment manifests, and improvised electronics she had no category for at all. The work being done at those stations had the focused quality of people who had been doing a specific difficult thing for a long time, and were very near its conclusion. In the center of the room, on the floor, Lena Estival sat cross-legged with her hands flat on her thighs and her eyes closed. Around her, at a radius of approximately 2 meters, 12 other people sat in the same posture. They ranged from about 16 to perhaps 40. All of them had the same stillness, not the stillness of sleep, not the stillness of meditation in the conventional sense, but the specific quality of profound directed attention applied inward, toward something only they could perceive. Their faces had an expression Mara didn't have a word for. Purposeful, calm, present at a depth that ordinary waking attention didn't usually reach. The grow lamps were running in this room, casting the same low green warmth over everything. The green light on Lena's face made her look younger than 19 and older at the same time. Sarat stood beside Mara and kept her voice low. 7 days ago, Lena established a resonance thread between herself and 17 threaders positioned in tunnel networks under 3 other cities. 700 kilometers, no Velkarath equipment, no signal infrastructure. A pause. The Dominion's network, the 600 human threaders they're currently using. Those people are conscious. They're in pain. And when one of ours reaches out through the network and makes contact with one of theirs, they respond. They have been waiting to respond for a very long time. Mara looked at the circle. She thought about the dream, the patient pale green eyes, the figure at the edge of something dark, the quality of something held open and waiting. She thought about 4 months of reaching through a suppression field designed to prevent exactly this kind of transmission. You're going to disrupt the network from inside, she said. Thread into the Velkarath's human infrastructure and pull the routing capacity away from them. Disrupting it for 6 hours would prevent coordination of the harvest teams across all 14 cities in this sector, Sarat said. The harvest depends on synchronized collection. Teams moving simultaneously. No individual city's resistance able to signal the others in time to organize. 6 hours of communication failure, and the harvest becomes 14 separate small operations rather than one coordinated sweep. 14 operations we can respond to locally. She looked at Mara sidelong. What we don't have is someone who can get us the harvest team's timing and deployment, the exact schedule, the patrol rotations, a deliberate pause, someone with active bureau access. Mara looked at the bypass kit on her wrist. She looked at Lena sitting in the green light, and at the people around her, and at the 30 working at the stations, and she thought about 9,000 people in the dark, under a city that had forgotten they were there. How long have you been waiting for someone like me to come down, she asked. We hoped it wouldn't take as long as it did, Sarat said. Lena has been threatening you for 4 months. She aimed for a bureau officer. She aimed for a threader with bureau access, who was running a suppressor bypass and pulling restricted files, and had been doing something other than the bureau's work for most of her career. Sarat said it without particular inflection, but the precision of it was deliberate. She wasn't certain you existed. She threaded in a direction and hoped you were there. Mara looked at Lena again. The girl's face was perfectly still, but there was something beneath the stillness. A quality of listening that wasn't for sounds in the room. She can hear this conversation, Mara said. Not exactly. She's aware of you. She can feel that you're here. Sarat's voice was quiet. She has been feeling that you were coming for 4 months. Mara crouched at the edge of the circle, not close enough to breach it. She didn't know the protocol, and she wasn't going to assume there wasn't one. She looked at Lena's face, at the pale green of her closed eyelids, at the absolute composure of someone who had decided something profound and found in the decision a clarity that erased the ordinary background noise of fear. I'll get you the schedule, Mara said. Not to Sarat, to Lena. I'll get everything I can get. The girl didn't open her eyes. But the quality of her stillness changed, in a way that wasn't visible, but was somehow perceivable. The same way you could feel a breath in a dark room without seeing any movement. Mara stood. I have to go back above, she said. I need my access credentials intact, and I need to not be missing from the dormitory. I know, Sarat said. We mapped an exit route for you. You don't have to go back above. You could after, Mara said. She said goodbye to Sarat. She went back to the entrance of the circle and crouched one more time and looked at Lena's face and said, Your father is trying to help. He doesn't know how yet. I'm going to give him something to do. She paused. And I'm going to come back. The pale green eyelids, the absolute still, the quality of someone very far away and very present at the same time. She went up. The 9 days that followed were the most careful of Mara Voss's professional life, because she was doing 2 things simultaneously that required complete incompatibility in their surfaces. Being the bureau officer everyone had known for 11 years, and being something else entirely. She worked her regular shifts. She processed compliance reports, 23 per day, residential compliance checks, and resource allocation updates, and the ordinary bureaucratic maintenance of a conquered city trying to hold its shape. She attended 2 interdepartmental briefings and contributed to each exactly as much as was expected. She ate the gray protein paste. She slept on her cot with the bypass kit throttled low to preserve components, and in the thin margin of cognitive clarity the throttled bypass provided. She felt the edges of the thread Lena had put in her mind. Not a signal exactly. More like the structural awareness of a connection that was there and operational and waiting. On day 3, she pulled the harvest team's deployment schedule from the Bureau's restricted logistics files. She framed the query as a resource allocation projection for the Eastern District, a category of query she made regularly enough that it would appear in her file without anomaly. She got the full schedule, team assignments, collection routes, sequence of addresses, backup protocols, the precise timeline from first deployment to final staging at the processing tower's intake facility. She memorized every line of it. She destroyed the query log with a standard file management command that she had always used for routine data hygiene, which meant its absence from the record would look like habit rather than concealment. She went down that night through a different shaft. Sarat had marked 3 alternatives for her in a notation system in 3 different locations that only she and Sarat knew to look for, and she was in the tunnel network for 40 minutes. She gave Sarat the schedule. She came back up. On day 5, she pulled the Velkarath's patrol rotation for the processing tower and the surrounding 4-block administrative zone. This required a different kind of query. She needed a plausible operational reason, and she built 1/2 days of casually mentioned concerns about an unrelated transport coordination issue, establishing a paper trail of legitimate interest before she made the pull. She got the rotation schedule, the patrol routes, the response protocols. She memorized it. She went down that night and passed it across. On day 6, the bureau officer named Callan stopped her in the cafeteria and told her she looked tired. Callan was competent in the way of people who had oriented their competence toward institutional self-preservation, rather than anything the institution was nominally for. He had a gift for noticing things that might be useful, and a consistent policy of converting them into capital. He had been watching Mara with the specific attention of someone who had noticed a colleague acting with unusual care, and Mara had known for 4 days that he was watching and had done nothing to either stop or confirm what he was seeing, because any visible response to being watched would confirm more than being watched did. Working on a case, she said. The Estival girl, still pursuing leads. I heard Estival Sr. made inquiries through the tower about the investigation. Callan poured himself coffee. Actual coffee. A collaborator-tier luxury he managed to procure through relationships Mara had never tried to trace. Just a heads up. Someone at the tower is interested in this case's resolution. I appreciate you telling me, she said. He left. She finished her protein paste and spent the remainder of her shift processing compliance reports. Without any visible change in pace or focus. Either she was already compromised, and the next step was outside her control, or she wasn't, and there was only the work. She had made her peace with that particular binary 3 days into the 9. There was no middle position. There never had been. On day 8, she went to see Estival. He received her in the same apartment, sitting in the same chair, with a man's way of sitting when he has been waiting too long for something and has burned through most of what sustained him. His wife was absent. Kale was in the side room doorway again, watching, and his expression had changed. The hostility had resolved into something more focused, like anger that had found a direction and was deciding whether to move. Have you found her? Estival asked. Yes, Mara said. He exhaled, a fractional unclenching in his face. The beginning of something. Immediately followed by the recognition that she had stopped speaking, and her stopping meant the relief was premature. He reassembled himself. Where? He asked. Safe. Somewhere the harvest team won't find her on their own. He stood. He went to the window with the movement of a man who needs to look at something, other than the face delivering information he doesn't want. The tower's smog column was visible from here, turning amber in the late afternoon light. The chemical sweetness came in faintly around the window seals. I have connections, he said. I've been working on this for 8 months. There are relationships I can call on. Protocols for family cooperation that allow for timeline. There are no protocols, Mara said. Not for her. The designation isn't what the Bureau tells families it is. He turned from the window. The softness in his face had organized itself into something harder. He was, she saw, not actually surprised. He was a man who had spent 8 months not thinking clearly about the thing he'd been told not to think clearly about, and the suppressor on his wrist was standard collaborator-tier issue. And he had been not thinking about this with the specific effort of someone who had somewhere suspected what the truth was and could not afford to know it. She's my daughter, he said. I know. Mara held his eyes. She knows, and she's safe. And she's chosen what she wants to choose. I need you to do something. He listened. She told him about the false address, the decommissioned bureau substation, empty, the kind of location a designated citizen might plausibly have been confined by a nervous family, trying to control the situation plausible enough to buy harvest time. She needed him to contact his tower connection and report that his daughter had been located and would be available for collection at that address on the morning of the harvest. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. If they discover the address is false, he said, they will know I gave it, yes. They will come for me, yes. Another silence. The tower's column turned darker as the light shifted. The boy in the doorway had come 3 steps into the room without Mara noticing. He was near, enough now that she could see the same pale green in his eyes. The same bone structure as his sister, The same quality of paying very careful attention to everything. Esteval looked at his son. Something passed between them that Mara wasn't meant to see and looked away from. There are exit routes, she said. Tunnel networks. A contact who can get you and your family out of the city in the window the disruption creates. She looked at Esteval directly. Your son, your wife, the youngest child, all of them. She paused. Your daughter will be at the northern junction at 0400 the morning after the harvest. She'll want to see you. Esteval put both hands on the back of the chair in front of him. He stood there for a moment with his head down, his large hands pressing into the upholstery, and she let him be in whatever that moment was, without interrupting it. Then, he straightened. He looked at Mara. In the quality of his posture, she saw something that had arrived in the last 10 seconds. Not courage exactly, because courage implied a previous absence. More like a decision that had been standing in a waiting room for a very long time, and had finally been called in. What do you need me to say to the tower? He asked. The night before the harvest, Mara went below for the last time. She came down the eastern shaft with the bypass kit, running at full output on its last components, and felt her mind expand in the specific way that expansion felt after years of compression. Not comfortable, not painless, but clarifying. Like the first breath after a long time underwater. The main hub was quiet, with the quiet of a space that has been partially evacuated. The workshop stations were dark, the communal areas empty, of the ordinary activity of 1,500 people living together. What remained was stripped down and purposeful. A skeleton crew, moving with the focused efficiency of people who had done the planning and were now inside the execution and had stopped thinking about anything except what the next 4 hours required. Mara moved through it and toward the lit room. The circle had expanded. 22 now, where there had been 13 on her first visit. Additional threaders pulled in from connected tunnel networks. People who had come long distances through the Undercity to sit in a circle in a green-lit room and do something that had no name in the Bureau's operational vocabulary. They sat with eyes closed and hands flat, and the absolute stillness of directed attention at maximum depth. The grow lamps gave them all the quality of something underwater, or something that hadn't quite arrived in the ordinary world yet. Lena was at the center, 19 years old with sand-colored hair and the pale green eyes that had been visiting Mara's sleeping mind for 4 months, and the expression on her still face was the expression from the dream. Patient, unafraid, present at a depth that the ordinary surface of things couldn't reach. Sarat stood at the edge. 4 hours until 0200, she said when Mara arrived. That's when we start. And the disruption, if it works, will last until approximately 0600 at minimum. Long enough for the harvest teams to miss their coordination window. Long enough for the exit teams to move. She looked at the circle. We've confirmed contact with 31 of the imprisoned threaders in the Dominion's network. Most of them responded immediately when we reached them. Her voice was level, but Mara heard in it something that wasn't level. The specific quality of having carried grief for a very long time in a body that had learned to carry weight efficiently. Most of them have been in the system for at least 11 years. 31 people, conscious for 11 years, inside the Velkarath's communication architecture. 31 people who had been waiting, without knowing what they were waiting for someone to reach through from outside. Mara walked to the edge of the circle. She crouched. She looked at Lena. I have a message from your father, she said. The stillness didn't change, but the quality of the listening did. He'll be at the northern junction at 0400 with your brother and your mother and Dara. She used the youngest child's name, which she had found in the family file 3 days ago, and memorized for this specific moment. He wants you to know he's sorry. He said to say it exactly like that. Just, I'm sorry. And he said you'd know what it means. A single tear ran down Lena's cheek. She didn't stop it or wipe it away. Her face stayed still, and her hand stayed flat, and the tear caught the green light and ran down to her jaw and fell. There it is, Mara thought. That's the thing that none of this exists without. Not the planning, not the years of preparation, not the 9,000 people, not the 31 conscious minds waiting in the dark of the Dominion's network for someone to come. A father's apology carried underground by a bureau officer who spent 4 months being visited in her sleep. A tear that said, "I know, and I receive it, and we can move forward now." She stood. She looked at Sarat. "I'm going back up," she said. "There are 64 people on the Eastern District's harvest list that your network hasn't reached yet. I have their addresses. I can get to them before the teams mobilize." She touched the bypass kit. "After tonight, this doesn't matter as a secret. I might as well use what's left of it." Sarat looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating gaze she had worn at the beginning. Then she reached out and gripped Mara's wrist, the one without the kit, and held it for the length of 3 breaths with a force that was not affection exactly, but was something more substantial than respect. "The exit route I mapped for you comes up 2 blocks from Estival's contact point," she said. 0430, after the teams are in disarray. Someone will be at the junction to take you through. "I know," Mara said. "You should also know," Sarat said, "that we have been wrong about things. We could be wrong about this. Threading 62 people in the Vel-Karath's network at once, over 600 kilometers, we have never tried it at that scale. I know that too. If it fails." "It doesn't matter if it fails," Mara said. "What happens after failure matters. What we do after matters." She looked at the circle one more time. "Lena knows how to fail and try again. She's been threading through a suppressor at me for 4 months. She didn't stop when it didn't work the first time." Sarat released her wrist. Mara went up. She spent 3 hours walking through the Eastern District in the cold dark, with the bypass kit running on its last components, knocking on doors in a city that had been asleep since the chemical sweet smell of the tower exhaust had thickened with the night air. She knocked, and she identified herself, and she said, in the plain and unhurried language of someone who has gone past the point where performance has any value, "The harvest team has a false address for the first hour. You have until 0400. Take your family and go. There is a contact at the Northern Junction who will take you into the network." Some people went immediately. Some people argued. Some people were frightened by the bureau jacket and tried to close the door, and she held it open with her hand and said again, "You have until 0400, and spoke the contact's recognition phrase, which Sarat had given her and which functioned as the credential that wasn't a credential, but was the only one that mattered. 37 addresses. 61 people, most of them young, most of them designated in the current cycle, most of them standing in the specific terror of a person who has been waiting for the moment when they would have to choose and is being told by a Compliance Bureau investigator in the middle of the night that the moment is now." She was walking toward the 44th address when it happened. She felt it through the soles of her feet first. Not a physical vibration, nothing seismic, but the cognitive equivalent, a change in the substrate of something she hadn't known she was standing on. Then it came through the bypass kit's attenuated channel, with the force of a signal that had been building for months, and had finally found its full amplitude. A door opening, not a metaphor and not exactly literal. A door in the architecture of perception, in the space behind her eyes, where the thread had been running, since Lena had first reached for her, 4 months ago, across a suppressor field and a prassa, 100 meters of concrete, and the full weight of an 11-year-old occupation. And through it, in the way that isn't words, but carries everything words carry and more. "We're in." Mara stopped walking. She stood on the empty street in the cold night and felt the shape of what was happening 2 levels below her feet. Felt it through the floor, through 6 meters of concrete, and through the accumulated weight of a city built on top of its own history. Felt 22 human minds in a circle, directing something outward through a communication network. The Vel-Karath had spent 30 years building, with the harvested capacity of the species they were supposedly administering. She felt it, and she kept walking. There were 20 more doors. 12 minutes after she felt the thread connect, the processing tower went dark, not a power failure. The tower's own systems ran on Dominion power independent of the city grid. The darkness was internal. The administrative levels went offline. The communication arrays on the tower's upper structure. She would later confirm this from Bureau Incident. Reports she pulled in her final 2 days of access went silent, not static. Silent. The Velcarath's communication architecture, threading through 600 human minds across 14 cities, was still running, but the humans at its nodes were no longer routing what the Dominion sent. They were routing something else, something that had never traveled those channels before, and had no Velcarath category, and for which the Dominion systems had no suppression protocol because they had never imagined it was possible. The sound, the cognitive signal, the threading resonance of 9,000 people in the dark, choosing to still be human. Mara worked through 19 more doors in the 2 hours that followed. She stopped keeping count of faces. She stopped performing the bureaucratic neutrality and simply told the truth as plainly and quickly as she could, and trusted that people who had been living under this occupation for 30 years knew how to read the plainness of a person who had stopped performing. At 0347, she went to the Northern Junction herself, not as an escort, but as one of the group, and found Estevil there with his wife and Kale, and the youngest Dara, a child of perhaps 9, who was holding Kale's hand and looking around at the tunnel entrance with the specific calm of a child who has taken their cue entirely from the adults nearest them and is trusting their interpretation of the situation. Kale saw Mara first. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the doorway of his father's apartment, with the pale green eyes and the focused attention of someone who has been taking very careful notes for a very long time. Then he nodded at her, once, with the formality of someone twice his age. Estival looked at the tunnel entrance. He looked at his wife, and at Dara, and then at Mara. "She's inside," Mara said. "She's past the junction. She's waiting." He nodded. He went through the door. Mara stood at the junction and watched the last of the people she'd moved through doors in the past 3 hours filter in around her. Guided by the tunnel contacts Sashret had positioned at each access point, she counted faces without meaning to. She thought about the 47 people on the harvest list who hadn't opened their doors, or hadn't believed her, or had already been collected before she reached them, and she let herself feel the weight of that number for exactly the time it took to walk through the junction door, and then she set it in the place where she kept the things she couldn't change and kept moving. She found Sarat at the inner junction, and Sarat's face had something in it that Mara had not seen there before. Not relief, too premature for relief, but a quality of arrival, of being at the moment you have been moving toward for 18 years. "Lena?" Mara asked, exhausted, intact. Sarat looked past Mara toward the entrance. 31 confirmed free of the network. The ones taken in the last cycle, 12 of them are coherent. The others. She stopped. The ones taken earliest. The integration was too complete. Mara thought about Sarat's sister. She didn't ask. The answer was in the quality of the silence that followed. "The disruption is holding," she asked. "The teams are in disarray. We're getting fragments through the tunneler network. People relaying what they're seeing above. The Eastern District teams couldn't reach their coordination channel. They showed up at Estival's false address and found an empty substation. A pause. They're recalibrating. They'll recover. This isn't an ending." "I know," Mara said. She found Lena at a rest point, 50 meters into the inner tunnel, sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up and a cup of something hot in her hands, and her face had the quality of a person who has been somewhere very far away for a very long time and has just come back to the room. She looked up when Mara crouched in front of her. "You came back," Lena said. "I said I would. I know. I heard you." She looked down at the cup. "I heard you tell me to keep going. When you were leaving the first time, I held on to that." She looked up. "Did you reach my family?" "They're here. Your father and Kale and your mother and Dara. They went through the inner junction 40 minutes ago." Something in Lena's face broke open and rebuilt itself in a different shape. She pressed her lips together and nodded once, tightly, and then she straightened and looked at Mara with the pale green eyes from the dream, clear and tired and present. "Thank you," she said. Mara sat down against the wall beside her. The tunnel was quiet around them. Far above, the city was dealing with the aftermath of a 4-hour communication failure. Teams that had missed their coordination window, and a processing tower that had gone dark in ways nobody in the Bureau had categories for. "How many did you reach?" Mara asked. "In the network." 31 who could come free, Lena said. Her voice was level but tired in the deep way, tired at the cellular level. "And I felt others, ones who couldn't. The integration was too old, too complete, but they knew someone was there. They felt it." She paused. "I don't know if that matters." "It matters," Mara said. They sat in the tunnel for a while without speaking. The grow lamp at the junction ahead gave the air a faint green quality. The same light that had been in the room where Mara had first seen Lena, sitting still, and Mara thought about 4 months of dreams that had been a 19-year-old girl, threading herself through a suppressor bar field, the dark and showing a bureau officer her face, because she had calculated, correctly, that there was a door that could be opened from the inside, and she needed someone on the other side. The Velkarath would recover. They would redesign their harvest protocols, recalibrate their screening for the specific neurological profile that had disrupted this cycle, build new safeguards against the threatening capacity they had spent 30 years believing they could contain by harvesting it out of the general population. They had time and resources and an institutional patience that made human planning feel like weather. The occupation wasn't over. The suppressor on Mara's wrist was still pulsing. Lower than usual, the bypass exhausted, but pulsing. None of that erased what had happened in the dark beneath this city in the last 4 hours. None of it put back the 412 people who had not been taken tonight, or the 31 who had been freed from the network, or the 9,000 who had been living in the tunnels for 18 years and had built, in the dark, out of salvage and determination, and the specific human genius for finding ways to be together, something that was not a substitute for the surface world above, but was real and functional, and entirely their own. The Velkarath had been harvesting a capacity for 30 years. They had built a communication network that ran on human minds, believing that the minds were a resource, predictable, catalogable, sustainable, in the way of any managed system. They had never considered what the minds might do if they talked to each other. They had never factored in what it meant that the resource they were harvesting was a species. Species, Mara thought. Talk. She stood. She touched Lena's shoulder once, briefly, and said, "Rest. Your family is waiting." She walked toward the inner junction and the exit route Sarah had mapped for her. She was still thinking about the dream as she walked. The specific quality of it, the way the pale green eyes had held something patient and deliberate across 4 months of suppressor pulses and concrete, and the full operational weight of the Compliance Bureau pressing down between them. She thought about what it had taken, a 19-year-old girl in a tunnel, sitting very still, reaching outward, through everything designed to prevent reaching, threading her face into the sleeping mind of a woman she'd never met, and showing her, night after night, the simple image of someone standing at the edge of something dark and looking back. "Come find me." And the answer that the answer had always been, even when she hadn't known she was answering, "I'm already coming." She found the junction contact at the marked point, and she stepped through the tunnel and toward whatever came next, and she didn't look back, because looking back was for people who still had somewhere to look from. She had done the only thing that had been hers to do. She was still doing it. 3 days after the disruption, the Velkarath issued a sector administrative notice. Through what remained of their human-facing communication infrastructure, Mara read it in the Bureau's briefing room alongside Dresh and 17 other officers who had been there long, enough to know that administrative notices of this length and tone from the tower always meant something specific had gone wrong. The notice described the events of the harvest night as an isolated technical failure in communication relay infrastructure attributed to degradation in equipment components operating past projected service life. It announced a revised harvest timeline, postponed by 40 days, pending infrastructure review. It noted that 18 of the 412 designated citizens in the eastern sector had been successfully collected and were in integration processing at the tower facility. 18 out of 412. Dresch read the notice twice. He set it on the table. He looked at his coffee. Mara watched him not react, and watched the effort it cost, and thought, he already knows. The briefing room cleared. Dresch didn't leave. Mara didn't leave. They sat at the table with the notice, between them and the smog column visible through the window and the chemical sweetness of the morning air coming in, around the edges of the Bureau's climate management system, which had been running on reduced capacity since the night of the disruption because 3 of its operating parameters connected to the tower's infrastructure and the tower's infrastructure had been unavailable for 4 hours and 17 minutes. The Eastern District evacuation, Dresch said. He said it without prelude, without accusation. He said it the way a man says a thing he's been carrying for 3 days and has finally decided is too heavy to carry the way he's been carrying it. Yes, Mara said. How many? 263. Who I reached directly or through the TIL contact network. More from the other districts. I don't have final numbers. Sarat's teams have been tracking it. He was quiet for a long moment. Sarat. She's been below for 18 years. She'd lead the settlement network. Mara kept her voice level. 9,000 people across the tunnel system under this city, not residual survivors. A community with infrastructure and planning and 18 years of preparation for exactly what happened 3 nights ago. Dresch picked up his coffee and set it down without drinking from it. The specific gesture of a man doing something with his hands, so his face doesn't do something he doesn't intend. Kavash's file, he said. The restricted one. He found them. The tower flagged his file to make sure the Bureau didn't follow up. Mara looked at the notice on the table. The tower has always known the tunnels aren't empty. They've chosen not to act, because acting would require resources, and the tunnel population poses no threat to harvest operations under ordinary circumstances. She paused. These were not ordinary circumstances. No. He finally drank the coffee. The boy, Estival's boy, Kale. She hadn't told him about the Estival family. She looked at him. He came to see me yesterday, Dresch said. He said his father sent him. That his father wanted me to know that the family was safe. And that someone named Sarat had a message for anyone at the Bureau who wanted to know how to find the exit route. Mara felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't been aware was tight. He's 16, she said. He has his sister's eyes. Dresch set the coffee down. He looked at the smog column, the revised harvest in 40 days, when the Velkarath's infrastructure review is complete. Yes, 412 designated citizens in this sector, minus 18 already collected. He did the arithmetic aloud, which meant he was doing it for her benefit. Not because he needed to. 394 people who are still in this city. Plus however many will be designated in the revised cycle, Mara said. They'll expand the net. The failure rate will tell them the current screening methodology has gaps. They'll look for additional threaders. They'll look harder. And the tunnel settlement. We'll be prepared for that too, she said. They've been thinking about it longer than the Velkarath has. Dresch was quiet for a long time. Outside, a Bureau transport moved down the street below the window. Slow, deliberate, the particular pace of official vehicles, in a city that had been tense since the disruption, as if moving carefully would prevent something from breaking. She watched it and thought about the 40-day window, about 394 people, about what could be done in 40 days with Bureau access by someone who had spent 11 years building a working relationship with a suppressor bypass and a collection of restricted files, and the specific practice skill of doing 2 things at once while appearing to do only one. The exit route, Mara said. KL gave you the location? He gave me a notation system, Dresch said. Symbols at junction walls in the eastern utility access. He said if I went to the eastern substation after shift, someone would meet me. He looked at her sideways, with the expression of a man who has decided something and is announcing it obliquely. He said to bring anyone I trusted. Mara looked at Dresch. She thought about 16 years of sitting across from each other in the cafeteria, eating protein paste, and not saying the things that didn't need to be said because they could be read from each other's careful silences and deliberate non-reactions. She thought about what trust meant after 16 years of practiced indifference to each other's welfare, and the specific quality of care that had been underneath the indifference the entire time, too dangerous to name, too real to abandon. How many people do you trust? She asked. He thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. 6, he said. Maybe 8. Bureau access, she said. Scheduling, logistics, harvest team routing. All of it, he agreed. 40 days, she said. 40 days, he said. They sat at the table a moment longer, with the Velkareth's administrative notice between them and the smog column, turning in the morning air outside, the processing tower running on its restored infrastructure, the harvest cycle reset and recalibrating, the Dominion's long patience, already at work, on the problem of what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from going wrong again. Then Dresch finished his coffee. He stood. He picked up the notice, folded it with the specific care of someone preserving a document they intend to keep, and put it in his jacket pocket. After shift, he said. Eastern substation. He left. Mara sat at the table alone for a minute. She looked at the smog column and thought about the shape of what the next 40 days would require, and the 40 days after that, and the cycle after the next one, and the long work of a species that had been pushed below and found in the dark, not a debate, but a room in which to plan. She thought about Lena sitting at the center of a circle of 22 people, threading their collective capacity into the architecture of an alien occupation and pulling, and the sound of it, the sound that had no frequency the Velkarath had a suppression protocol for, because the Velkarath had never encountered it from inside their own system, the sound of a species that had been told it was a resource, and had declined to accept that category, the sound of 9,000 people in the dark choosing, every single day, to remain human. She stood. She picked up her tray. She went back to work. The suppressor pulsed at the base of her skull, calibrated and precise, doing everything it had always been designed to do. She let it pulse. She was already thinking around it. 2 weeks after the disruption, a message came through the tunnel's internal relay network. Not a threading signal, just old-fashioned paper, passed hand to hand through 4 transfer points across the Undercity, until it arrived at the inner junction. Contact who left it in Mara's drop location, at the base of the eastern shaft. The message was from one of the 31 freed threaders. His name, she learned, had been Pete Solano. He had been taken in the cycle 11 years ago at 19 and had spent 11 years conscious inside the Velkarath's communication architecture. The message was 6 lines long and had been written in the specific cramped hand of someone relearning how to hold a pen after a long time in which the body had been present, but the hands had belonged to something else. The message said, I remember the city above. I remember it had a bakery on the corner of the junction near the Southern Transit platform, and the smell of bread reached the street for half a block. I want to know if the bakery is still there. I want to know if anything is still the same as I remember it. I want to know if there is anything worth returning to when we can return. Mara folded the message and kept it. She thought about the bakery. She knew the corner he meant. She had walked past it 100 times. The Bureau's southern boundary ran 2 blocks from there. The bakery was not still there. The building was a Velkarath resource distribution node now, which was what most of the city's independent food infrastructure had become in the first decade of the occupation, replaced by the gray protein paste and the measured allocation and the chemical sweet smell of processed nutrition that came from the tower's output. She wrote back, The bakery is gone. But the corner is still there. The junction still runs. The smell of the street in the mornings is still specific to this city, and no other. The stone and the water from the old drainage system, and the particular mix of dust and air that comes from being this city in this part of the world. You will recognize it when you return. There will be something to return to, because people are making something to return to, right now, in the dark. You should know that. She put the message in the drop. She went back to work. The days had a rhythm now. Bureau shifts, the surface work of appearing to be what she had always appeared to be, pulling the right informations in the right order, from the right systems, at the right moments, in the right framing, so that each pull looked like its legitimate cover story, and the aggregate looked like the ordinary noise of a mid-career compliance officer working an open caseload. She had gotten very good at this over 11 years. She was better at it now, because now she knew what it was for. Below, in the hours between shift end and mandatory dormitory check-in, she went through the tunnels with Sarat, or with KL, who had become. She wasn't sure exactly when this had solidified. Her primary contact for the work of the 40-day window. He was 16 and precise, and had an aptitude for logistics that his father had passed down and which had, in KL, combined with something his father didn't have. A willingness to follow the logic all the way to the end of what it required. There are 47 more designated citizens in the Eastern District who don't know about the network. He told her on the 9th day after the disruption, sitting in the tunnel with a handwritten list that he had compiled from sources she had decided not to ask him to identify precisely. And 63 in the Southern Quarter, who the Southern Tunnel Group can reach if we give them the routing. Information from Bureau Logistics. The Southern Quarter routing is in the restricted infrastructure files, Mara said. I know. He looked at her. Can you get it? She thought about Dresch and his 6 or 8 trusted people. She thought about what 6 or 8 Bureau officers with active credentials could do in 30 days, with a clear list of priorities and a tunnel contact system already in place. Yes, she said, she got it. The work was not elegant. It was not the work of people with training or resources, or the institutional support that makes operations clean and recoverable. It was the work of people who had decided that the 40-day window was what they had, and the limits were what they were. And you worked inside the limits with what existed, rather than waiting for conditions that would never be optimal. It was the work of Dresch sitting down with 6 trusted colleagues one at a time and having the conversation that couldn't be had in groups, feeling out each person's private calculation, finding the ones who had been waiting for someone to confirm that their private calculation was shared. It was the work of Kale, moving through the tunnel network with the marking system in his memory, and a runner's capacity for covering distance in the dark. It was the work of Saret's settlement teams, coordinating the exits and the contacts, and the orientation of people who had come below recently, and were still learning the geography of a world that existed in parallel with the surface world they'd left. And it was, in a way she hadn't expected, the work of the freed threaders. The 31 people who had been pulled free of the Velkarath's network were not, most of them, in a condition to contribute to operational planning in the first weeks. What Lena had described as the experience of being in the network. The persistent, total connectivity, every signal of an interstellar civilization transmitting through your mind simultaneously. No privacy of cognition, no silence, no way to close your own internal door, left a mark that didn't resolve quickly. They needed quiet. They needed the specific kind of time that was just time without demands, which was not something the tunnel settlement had in abundance, but which Saret made available by consensus, without debate, because the consensus was that these people had earned it. But as the days accumulated, some of them started showing up at the workstations, not for the high-demand threading sessions. Lena and the Circle were conserving capacity, maintaining the connections they'd established, and preparing for the next cycle. But for the ordinary work of keeping the settlement running, for the construction and maintenance and cooking and teaching that constituted the actual texture of 9,000 people living in the dark together. Piet Solano, who was 30, not 19, because 11 years had passed, turned out to have been an engineer before the harvest. He had been taken at 19 for his threading capacity, but what he remembered most clearly from the surface was not the bakery, but a subsurface drainage project he had been apprenticed to the summer before his designation. He started walking the tunnel walls with the same focused attention Mara associated with Surrette's navigation, but with a different object. Assessing the structural integrity of the archways, finding the places where deferred maintenance had created risk, making lists in the same cramped hand as his message. She found him at it one afternoon and asked what he was doing. There are 3 load-bearing arches in the eastern sector that need reinforcement within 6 months, he said. He showed her the list. The engineering notation was from before the occupation. She recognized it from pre-Dominion technical archives the Bureau kept as historical reference. He had picked it up at 19, and it had stayed intact through 11 years of being a wire. If they fail, the ceiling section over the northern hub collapses. He looked at the arch above them. I want to fix them. She looked at the arch. She thought about 9,000 people, whose ceiling Piet Solano wanted to ensure stayed up. Tell me what materials you need, she said. He told her. She found most of them in the Bureau's maintenance equipment manifest under a project description that was technically accurate. Substructure, assessment and reinforcement, Eastern District infrastructure, and requisitioned them through Dresch, using a legitimate safety justification that the Bureau's safety protocols required be acted on without delay. Dresch delivered them to the Eastern substation 3 days later, unloaded them himself, and left without asking Mara any questions she would have needed to answer truthfully. The arches were reinforced in 8 days. Piet Solano supervised the work himself, with the focused efficiency of someone who has been waiting for 11 years to do something with their hands again and is not going to waste the opportunity. The 39th day of the 40-day window, Mara went below for what she had decided would be the last time from the surface. The work wasn't done. It would never be done in any final sense. There would always be more designated citizens, and more cycles, and more of the long, slow pressure of an occupation that had been ongoing for 30 years and would continue. But the specific work of this window was as complete as she could make it. Dresch had confirmed a number. In the 40 days since the disruption, through the Bureau contacts he'd cultivated, and the tunnel network they'd connected to, and the exit routes they'd opened, and the addresses they'd reached in 3 districts beyond the eastern quarter, 311 designated citizens from the current harvest list had been moved below. Not all of them had stayed in the tunnel settlement. Some had taken the long exit routes to the rural districts, to the contacts Surrette had positioned there 2 years ago, but they were gone from the collection list. They were not going to the tower. 311 out of 394 remaining on the list after the first night. 83 people she hadn't reached. She carried that. She would carry it forward as the number she was working against in the next cycle. Lena was at the inner junction when Mara came through on her last above-surface visit. She had been in the threading sessions every day since the disruption, maintaining the connections with the freed network nodes, extending the thread in careful increments toward new contacts. There were, Surrette had told Mara, now 49 people they had active connection with in the Velkarath's network, still conscious after years in the system, still capable of receiving the threading signal from outside. She looked better than she had at the rest point on the first night, not recovered, that was going to take longer, but present in the full sense, her face holding the quality of someone who had chosen a difficult thing and was living inside the choice with something like equanimity. Tomorrow, Lena said. She meant the harvest cycle resumption. Tomorrow, Mara agreed. We're ready. I know. Lena looked at her, the pale green eyes, clear and tired and absolutely present. You don't have to come back above after tonight. You don't have to. I know, Mara said. But there's work up there that's easier from up there. For as long as I can do it. Dresch, he's staying above too, for now." She paused. He found 2 more bureau officers who wanted to know about the exit route. Both of them have been wearing suppressors for 8 and 12 years respectively. Both of them, when he throttled the suppressor with a kit he built from my notes, immediately pulled restricted files. They'd been meaning to pull for years. Lena smiled. It was a small smile, with something in it that Mara hadn't seen before on her face. Something lighter than the patient calm of the dream. Something that had space in it, for what was difficult, and was choosing to let some of it go. "My father says to tell you that he found the drainage system," Lena said. "The old one, from the preoccupation infrastructure. He's been mapping it. He says it connects to a district he didn't know was accessible." Mara thought about Esteval Sr., who had spent 15 years being a man, who read the current correctly, and went where it pointed, and who had in the space of one night made a different calculation, and found himself in the dark with a new set of skills to develop. "Tell him to share the maps with Pete," she said. "Pete will know what to do with them." Lena nodded. She looked at the junction behind Mara, the direction of the surface. "It's still dark up there, an hour before dawn." Mara stood. "Get some sleep." "After the session," Lena said. "The session first. Always the session first. Always the work of reaching out through every barrier designed to prevent the reaching, threading the human capacity for connection into the architecture of a system that had been built on the assumption that connection could be managed and allocated and suppressed. Always the patient outward extension of the specific thing that the Velkrath had decided was a resource and had spent 30 years harvesting. Not understanding that you couldn't harvest it without leaving it intact in the ones who remained. Not understanding that the ones who remained would find each other. Mara went up for the last time. The dawn was cold, and the smog column from the tower was visible in the pre-light of the horizon, turning the sky above it the specific amber that Mara had been watching from the cafeteria window for 11 years. The streets were empty at this hour. The bureau dormitory was 3 minutes' walk from the eastern substation. She stood on the street for a moment and breathed the morning air of the city. The stone and the water from the old drainage channels and the particular composition of dust and sky and lived in human accumulation that was this city and no other city. She thought about Piet Solano asking if there was anything worth returning to. Yes, she thought. It's worth returning to. It's worth working for. It's worth going below for, and coming back up for, and eating protein paste for, and wearing a suppressor for, and carrying the weight of 83 people you didn't reach for, because the work is the form that the answer takes, when the question is whether any of this matters. It matters, she thought, and felt the thread from Lena running warm and quiet at the back of her mind. Not a signal, not a message, just the structural awareness of a connection maintained, of someone on the other side of a door holding it open. She walked back to the bureau. She ate the protein paste. The suppressor pulsed at its calibrated frequency. Somewhere in the city, in the first gray light of a morning that would end with harvest teams mobilizing, and an occupation continuing, and all the vast patient machinery of the Dominion recalibrating around the problem of what had gone wrong. 311 people who had been on a list were not going to the tower today. In the tunnels below, 22 people were sitting in a circle, with their eyes closed and their hands flat, threading their collective capacity outward through 700 kilometers of dark, reaching for 49 minds that were waiting, that had been waiting for years, that had felt the signal 3 weeks ago, and were holding on to the knowledge that it existed and would come again. The suppressor pulsed. Mara Voss pressed her palm flat on the cafeteria table, and she thought around it, and she kept going.